last time I saw a map of Louisiana, this prison wasn't on it. Black Bayou Correctional Facility was a name I had never heard before, not in all my years working for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. And yet, my superior had slid a file across my desk, stamped with a classification level so high I had to sign 2 separate non-disclosure agreements before opening it. Inside, there was nothing. No case files, no mugshots, no criminal records. Just a 1-page document. At the top, in bold, blocky font, were the words, Black Bayou Correctional Facility, Classified Criminal Study. Beneath it, my assignment, study the inmates. Observe behaviors. Do not ask about their crimes. A small note was handwritten at the bottom. This prison is different. Follow their rules. My flight landed in New Orleans. My escort, a silent, broad-shouldered man in a DOC uniform with no name tag, drove me 4 hours into the swamps. The paved roads turned to dirt, then to gravel, then to something that wasn't the road at all. By the time we reached Black Bayou, the world felt different. The air was thicker, heavier. A fog rolled through the trees like it had been sitting there for centuries, never lifting. The prison itself was massive, but wrong. Built like a fortress, surrounded by high concrete walls lined with floodlights, but with no official signs. No guards at the entrance. Just a single rusted gate that opened by itself as our vehicle approached. As soon as I stepped out, the driver pulled away, never saying a word. That's when I noticed the folder taped to the front doors. A manila envelope, with my name written on it. I pulled it open. Inside was a list of rules. The rules of Black Bayou 1. You will be assigned an observation room. Once inside, you may study the prisoners, but do not make eye contact for more than 10 seconds. 2. The inmates are not to be spoken to directly. If they speak to you first, respond briefly. If they call you by name, leave immediately. 3. There is a prisoner in cell number 13. You will never see him. He does not appear on cameras. If the guards tell you he is present, do not acknowledge them. 4. If an inmate's reflection does not match his movements, end your session for the day. 5. You may hear knocking inside your observation room. You are alone. Do not answer. 6. If an inmate asks you what year it is, do not answer. Exit the room. 7. If you ever hear someone whisper, "You don't belong here," do not look around. Close your eyes and count to 30. 8. Under no circumstances should you be in the facility past midnight. If you are, do not attempt to leave. The doors will not open until sunrise. I read the list twice, then again. My hands were sweating. The front doors of the prison creaked open by themselves. I stepped inside, and from somewhere deep within the cell blocks, I heard the sound of knocking. Black Bayou. Correctional facility wasn't like any prison I'd ever seen before. The lobby was stark and cold, devoid of the typical institutional comforts I was used to. No badges, no metal detectors, no administrative desks. Just a long, gray corridor illuminated by flickering fluorescent bulbs that hummed like insects trapped behind the glass. The stale air reeked of damp concrete, mildew, and something else. A faint coppery tang that made the back of my throat itch. My footsteps echoed as I moved forward, the only sound apart from the low, persistent buzz of the lights. The folder with the rules felt heavy in my hand, its corners damp from my sweating palms. I glanced back once, but the front doors had already swung shut, sealing me in with a resonant thud. The deadbolt clicked loudly into place. A distant rhythmic knocking sounded again, coming from deep inside the facility. 3 slow taps, followed by silence, then 3 more. It echoed strangely, like knuckles striking wood underwater. I thought about rule number 5. You may hear knocking inside your observation room. You are alone. Do not answer. But I wasn't in my observation room yet, so who or what, was knocking. Swallowing hard, I moved farther down the hall until I reached a metal door marked simply, Observation Wing A. Beside it, an old yellowed keypad blinked intermittently. My instructions hadn't included a code, but when I stepped closer, the door swung open on its own, creaking ominously. Either someone was watching me closely, or this place operated by its own unsettling logic. Inside was a cramped, dimly lit corridor, lined with numbered rooms. Each door was made of thick, reinforced glass, framed by riveted steel. Inside the rooms were one-way observation windows, allowing a clear view into the corresponding cells beyond. The rooms were empty, save for a single metal chair and a narrow steel desk bolted to the concrete floor. I walked past several doors until I reached room number 9. The door stood ajar, waiting for me. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside, I took my seat. The metal was icy, sending another shiver through me. Through the window, I saw cell number 9 clearly, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Inside the cell sat a man, inmate number 0912, according to a small faded plaque below the window. He was wiry, middle-aged, with a head shaved so close I could see scars crisscrossing his scalp. Tattoos crawled up his neck like vines, disappearing beneath the orange prison jumpsuit. His hands rested in his lap, fingers twitching rhythmically. He stared directly at the observation window, as if he could see right through it. I reminded myself it was one-way glass. To him, it should have been just a mirrored surface. Yet his gaze felt uncomfortably precise, as if he were making eye contact. I checked my watch, trying to recall the rules. Do not make eye contact for more than 10 seconds. I tore my eyes away, forcing myself to look at the inmate's reflection in the window glass instead. That was safer. Or at least, it should have been. That's when I noticed something wrong. Inmate number 0912's reflection was different. Not drastically, but enough to make my pulse quicken. In the reflection, his posture was straighter. His fingers weren't twitching. They were motionless, folded neatly together. Most unsettlingly, his head in the reflection was tilted slightly to the side, a curious expression on his face, as if he were studying me, analyzing my every move. But in reality, the man in the cell was completely still, head straight, fingers still twitching. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced back at the rules. If an inmate's reflection does not match his movements, end your session for the day. But I'd only just begun. Was I supposed to leave already? As I debated, the inmate leaned forward suddenly, pressing his face close to the glass. His breath fogged up the cell side mirror. He reached out slowly, his fingertips brushing gently against the glass, tracing an invisible pattern. In the reflection, his hand remained motionless, resting calmly in his lap. I could hear my heart thudding in my ears, each beat echoing the same frantic warning. Get out. Get out now. But before I could move, he spoke. His voice was muffled, but the words were clear, as if he knew exactly how to project through the glass. You're new, aren't you? I remembered rule number 2. The inmates are not to be spoken to directly. If they speak to you first, respond briefly. Yes, I answered, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled. His teeth were crooked, stained yellow. The reflection's expression never changed. It was frozen in that unsettling tilt, still silently studying me. Welcome to Black Bayou, the inmate continued, voice low, almost conspiratorial. Have you figured it out yet? I felt dread pooling in my stomach. Figured what out? He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Why they sent you here. I hesitated, a chill snaking up my spine. They sent me to study behavior. His eyes glinted with amusement. They sent you here because they ran out of space." He paused, watching me closely, as if waiting for the realization to sink in. There's always room for one more. Before I could respond, a knock echoed behind me, loud and unmistakable. 3 taps like knuckles on glass. I spun around in my chair, pulse hammering. The room was empty. No one else was there. "You may hear knocking inside your observation room. You are alone. Do not answer." The inmate laughed softly. "Better follow those rules. They're there for a reason." I stood quickly, nearly toppling the chair. My hands shook as I grabbed my folder. "This session is over." He nodded slowly, smile widening. "Good. But don't worry, Agent. We'll be seeing a lot more of each other." His reflection still hadn't moved. It stared blankly ahead, lifeless and stiff, even as the inmate behind it leaned back, fingers twitching once again. I stepped into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wall. The inmate's words echoed in my mind, mingling with the slow, rhythmic knocking that had begun once more, this time louder and closer. They had sent me here to study prisoners. But deep down I was starting to wonder if I was the one being studied. The hallway lights flickered again, buzzing louder. The knocking continued, now echoing through the walls, following me as I stumbled back toward the entrance. But when I reached the front doors, they were locked. A small red digital clock beside them read 12:01 a.m. My heart sank. "Under no circumstances should you be in the facility past midnight. If you are, do not attempt to leave. The doors will not open until sunrise." I was trapped in Black Bayou until dawn, and the knocking grew closer with each passing second. The digital clock's glowing red digits, 12:01 a.m., burned into my vision as I stood frozen in front of the locked entrance doors of Black Bayou Correctional Facility. I pressed against the handle again, yanking with all my strength, but the metal refused to budge. It felt welded shut, immovable, as though it had never been meant to open from the inside. My breath fogged the glass, and panic tightened its grip on my chest, squeezing until my lungs felt starved for air. I spun around, back pressed to the cold steel doors, eyes darting frantically down the long, oppressive hallway I had just come from. It stretched on endlessly, swallowed by shadows that the flickering fluorescent lights couldn't penetrate. But the faint sound of rhythmic knocking was now clearer, louder, growing steadily closer from somewhere deep inside the facility. 3 sharp taps, pause, then 3 more, echoing through the empty corridor like the footsteps of something unseen, methodical, and patient. I checked my watch again, just to confirm. Yes, past midnight. I was stuck here until sunrise. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to find a safe place to wait out the next 6 hours. But nothing in this place felt safe. The only thing I had were the rules, still clutched tightly in my trembling hands. They felt flimsy, a fragile barrier between myself and whatever horrors lurked within these walls. The knocking continued, closing in. I remembered rule number 5. You may hear knocking inside your observation room. You are alone. Do not answer. But I wasn't in my observation room anymore. I was in the hallway. Was I still alone? I took a shaky breath, forcing myself forward, away from the sealed entrance and toward the relative familiarity of the observation wing. Perhaps I could barricade myself in one of those small rooms, wait until dawn broke and the doors unlocked themselves. I moved quickly, my shoes squeaking against the grimy tile floor. Each step echoed, announcing my presence to the silent cells around me. As I passed the doors, their numbers glinted faintly in the dim light. 9, 10, 11. Each door identical, thick reinforced glass framed by steel. Behind each one, the inmates sat motionless in their cells, oblivious to my passing. Some faced the walls, others stared blankly ahead, but none looked up. It was as if they had all simultaneously shut down at midnight, locked in their own private worlds. Then I saw it. Cell number 13. Unlike the others, this cell had no observation room. Its door stood alone at the end of the hall, sealed tight, windowless, marked only by a single number etched deep into the steel frame. The metal door was slightly rusted around the edges, as though it had been sealed and forgotten long ago. The air around it felt colder, denser, as though something had been trapped inside for years, pressing outward. I paused, recalling rule number 3. There is a prisoner in cell number 13. You will never see him. He does not appear on cameras. If the guards tell you he is present, do not acknowledge them. But there were no guards here. Only me, trapped and alone. I approached cautiously, my curiosity momentarily overpowering my fear. I pressed my ear gently against the door, listening for signs of life. The metal was icy against my skin, so cold it sent goosebumps racing down my neck. For a moment, there was only silence. Deep, absolute silence, like the quiet found at the bottom of an abandoned well. Then, softly at first, growing steadily louder, I heard breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic breaths, as if something massive slumbered just inches away. The sound was oddly hypnotic, resonating through the metal like a living heartbeat. It was almost soothing, until it stopped abruptly, leaving a void of sound that made my heart race. My breath hitched in my throat. My fingers trembled against the cold steel. For a heartbeat, I considered knocking, calling out, demanding answers. But a warning flashed through my mind, a single line from the rules. You will never see him. I pulled back quickly, turning away just as I heard the faintest whisper seep through the door. It was almost inaudible, but the words were unmistakable, slithering into my mind like a blade. You don't belong here. A jolt of icy dread shot through me. Rule number 7 screamed in my mind. If you ever hear someone whisper, "You don't belong here," do not look around. Close your eyes and count to 30. I squeezed my eyes shut instantly, hands clenched at my sides, pulse hammering so loud I was sure it echoed through the hallway. My lips moved silently, counting 1, 2, 3, each number dragging out painfully slow. Around 12, I felt a shift in the air. A cold breeze caressed the back of my neck, sending shivers cascading down my spine. My muscles tensed. My instinct was to spin around, to confront whatever had whispered. But I resisted, gripping the rules tighter, forcing my breath steady, continuing my count. 21, 22. The knocking began again, close now, directly behind me. It felt like someone tapping gently against the very space between my shoulder blades, teasing, waiting for me to crack. I clenched my jaw, continuing my silent count, willing my body not to react. 29, 30. The moment I opened my eyes, the knocking ceased. The hallway was empty. The cells were silent. The heavy door of cell number 13 remained closed. But something had changed. In front of me, on the ground, lay a single piece of paper. A note, slightly crumpled, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, barely legible. He sees you now. Welcome. My stomach twisted violently. I glanced up at cell number 13, and this time, the door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peering out from within. My blood turned to ice. The door had been sealed shut moments ago. I took a shaky step back, ready to flee, but the cell door swung slowly open, creaking on rusted hinges, revealing absolute darkness beyond. There were no walls visible, no bed, no bars, just a yawning void impossibly deep and endlessly black. And from somewhere inside that darkness came a slow, wet, dragging sound, like heavy limbs pulling across stone, inching closer to the threshold. I didn't wait to see what emerged. Turning on my heel, I sprinted down the hall, heart pounding furiously. The lights flickered erratically, plunging the corridor into brief, suffocating darkness before snapping back on, strobing like a nightmare. The knocking followed, echoing louder and closer behind me, no longer confined to the walls but ringing through the entire facility. I reached the observation room where I had started, diving inside, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my back to it, gasping for breath. The room was silent, empty, safe, I hoped. Then, slowly, I lifted my head, looking through the one-way glass into cell number 9. The inmate inside was no longer seated. He stood inches from the mirror, his face pressed against the glass. He smiled slowly, eyes boring directly into mine, as if the glass no longer separated us. "Glad you came back," he whispered, voice carrying easily through the barrier. "We're all glad you're staying." I glanced at my watch. 12:07 a.m. And I knew, with cold certainty, that dawn was still a long way off. The inmate in cell number 9 stood inches from the one-way glass, his nose nearly touching its reflective surface. His breath fogged the glass in rhythmic bursts, blurring the space between us. The smile on his face twisted slowly, the corners of his lips stretching into a grin that felt more predatory than human. His eyes, cold, unblinking, were locked directly onto mine, as though the protective barrier between us had ceased to exist. My pulse pounded like a drumbeat in my ears, a constant reminder of how wrong everything felt. According to every security measure I knew, the inmates couldn't possibly see through this mirror. Yet he stared at me with absolute certainty, his gaze piercing the thin veil of supposed safety. I wanted to step back, to retreat, but my body refused to move, paralyzed by the surreal nightmare unfolding before me. "How do you like your new accommodations?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft, almost casual, as though we were discussing the weather rather than the madness unfolding around us. His words carried easily through the thick glass, crisp and clear, making a mockery of the prison's carefully designed security features. I cleared my throat, trying to summon the strength to respond, remembering rule number 2. If they speak to you first, respond briefly. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaky and unconvincing even to my own ears. The inmate chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down my spine. "You're a terrible liar, Agent." I blinked, mouth dry. "Who are you?" His smile widened. "Just another prisoner, like you." My heart skipped a beat. "I'm not a prisoner." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with curious amusement. "Not yet." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. The words from the note I'd found outside cell number 13 echoed in my mind. "He sees you now. Welcome." "Who is he?" I demanded, voice barely above a whisper. The inmate's eyes darkened, pupils dilating slowly, as though something inside him had shifted. "The one who's been waiting. The one in cell number 13. The one you're not supposed to see." I glanced back toward the door, ensuring it was locked. The sound of distant knocking had finally ceased, leaving a void filled only by the inmate's slow, steady breathing. "What happens if I see him?" He leaned even closer to the glass, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then he gets out." A cold shudder racked my body. "What is this place?" I asked, desperately seeking some foothold in reality, a fragment of sense in the chaos. He smirked again, but this time that carried a trace of sympathy. "It's a cage, Agent, but not for us, for something worse. Something that feeds on fear, on confusion, on rules. He tapped the glass gently with one finger. "These rules aren't for you. They're for it. They keep it asleep, but you've broken too many already." I took a step back, horror dawning upon me. "I didn't break them. I followed every single one." He shook his head slowly. "You answered the knocking. You listened when you shouldn't have. And you saw him." His eyes flickered toward the hall, toward cell number 13, then back to me. "It's too late now." My breath quickened, panic flaring. "What do you mean it's too late?" He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced up at the corner of the room, to a small, previously unnoticed security camera. It blinked silently, its tiny red light pulsing like a heartbeat. I followed his gaze, dread coiling tighter inside me. The inmate spoke again, his voice filled with grim resignation. "The cameras aren't watching us. They're watching you. They're not studying us. They're studying you, seeing how long you can last, how far you'll bend before you break." I stepped further back, nearly stumbling over the metal chair. "That's impossible." "Is it?" he whispered softly. "Think about it. No one else is here. No guards, no staff. Just you and us. And it. They sent you here because they knew you'd fail, just like the rest of us." I felt bile rise in my throat. Why would they do that? "Because," he said, his voice hollow, empty, "someone has to keep him fed." My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. But before I could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief darkness before snapping back on. The inmate's expression had changed again. Now it was blank, emotionless, his face slack as if all life had drained from him in an instant. He stepped back from the glass, retreating to his cot in stiff, mechanical motions, sitting down without another word, staring blankly at the opposite wall as if the conversation had never occurred. I spun around, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The knocking had resumed, now slow and methodical, coming directly from behind the mirrored glass. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. I remembered rule number 5. You may hear knocking inside your observation room. You are alone. Do not answer. But the knocking wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from the mirror itself. From inside cell number 9. From a place that should have been empty, silent, safe. I edged closer to the door, but before I could open it, something shifted in the mirror's reflection. My eyes caught movement. A figure standing just behind me, indistinct but towering, impossibly thin and distorted, its form wavering as though seen through rippling water. I spun around, breath hitching, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, heart pounding furiously. The figure was still there, looming directly over my shoulder, its outline shuddering and twitching as if struggling to fully materialize. The air grew colder, denser, pressing against my lungs until each breath felt like a battle. I stumbled back, bumping against the wall. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, echoing through my skull. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. My vision blurred as I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but the metal burned cold against my palm, freezing me in place. The whisper returned, slithering into my ear like a living thing. You don't belong here. This time I ignored the rules. I couldn't close my eyes, couldn't count. All I could do was stare at the monstrous figure in the mirror, its head tilting slowly to one side as if observing my fear, savoring it. Then, abruptly, it lunged toward the glass, its distorted face pressing against the barrier. The mirror cracked audibly, spiderweb fractures spreading from where its forehead made contact. I felt warmth trickling from my nose, blood running freely. My vision spun as the figure pushed harder, straining to break through, the glass bulging outward impossibly. I finally wrenched the door open, stumbling into the hallway just as the mirror exploded inward. shards scattering across the floor behind me. I ran blindly, shoes crunching glass, breath ragged, heart threatening to burst. Behind me, echoing through the halls, the inmates' laughter followed, low, hollow, devoid of humanity. I turned a corner, coming face to face with the entrance doors again. They remained sealed tight, the clock blinking 12:45 a.m. There were still hours until sunrise. And deep inside Black Bayou, I could hear doors opening, one after another, each one bringing something closer to freedom, and closer to me. The clock's red digits flickered ominously. 12:45 a.m. The realization sank into me with cold, inexorable certainty. There were still more than 5 hours until dawn. 5 hours trapped inside Black Bayou Correctional Facility, where every shadow writhed, every sound whispered threats, and reality itself seemed eager to unravel. I leaned heavily against the locked entrance doors, my breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. The steel was icy against my back, grounding me momentarily. But it offered no comfort, no escape. The laughter from the inmate in cell number 9 still echoed through the winding hallways, hauntingly distant, yet all too present. Worse, something else was now awake, freed by my mistake, the thing behind the mirror, the entity lurking in cell number 13, and perhaps even something darker, older, woven into the very fabric of this place. I pushed myself away from the doors, forcing myself to think. I had to find somewhere to wait out the night, somewhere secure, defensible. But nowhere felt safe anymore. Every door I passed seemed to mock me, each corridor a maze designed to disorient and entrap. The inmates sat motionless in their cells, eyes hollow, faces slack, oblivious to the chaos unfolding just beyond their barred doors. My mind raced, searching desperately for an answer, a place to hide. My eyes fell on a sign near the end of the hallway, barely illuminated by a sputtering light. Security office. Authorized personnel. Only hope surged through me, fragile yet powerful. A security office might have monitors, communication equipment, weapons even, anything to help me survive the hours until dawn. I moved quickly, the corridor stretching before me, longer now, darker, as if the building itself was shifting, reshaping to hinder my progress. My footsteps echoed loudly, each step feeling heavier, as though the floor itself clung to my shoes, reluctant to let go. The knocking followed persistently, echoing behind walls, beneath the floor, always just out of sight. It mocked me, hunted me, whispering through rhythmic taps, "You're not alone. You'll never be alone again." I reached the security office door, its surface chipped, paint peeling like old skin. The keypad next to it was dark, wires dangling uselessly beneath. Panic threatened to rise again, but as my hand touched the cold metal handle, the door swung inward, unlocked. I hesitated, then stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. The room was cramped, stale-smelling, filled with ancient equipment, CRT monitors lining one wall, desks stacked high with yellowed papers, a rusted filing cabinet propped awkwardly against another. A single swivel chair, cracked and torn, faced the wall of screens. I moved toward it cautiously, heart pounding. Most monitors displayed static, hissing softly. But one flickered, revealing grainy footage from various cells. Each inmate sat motionless, almost identical in posture, facing blank walls. It was unsettling, unnatural. But then my breath caught. One monitor showed an empty cell, door ajar, labeled simply Cell Number 13. The darkness within writhed subtly, as if alive. I turned away quickly, scanning the desk. A landline phone rested there, coated in thick dust. I grabbed it, pressing it to my ear, fingers trembling as I dialed out. Nothing. No dial tone, no static. Just dead silence. Despair clawed at me, but I forced it down, searching the drawers for anything useful. One drawer contained a small flashlight, its metal body dented. I clicked it on. Its beam was weak, but better than nothing. As I turned, sweeping the light across the room, it illuminated something startling on the far wall. A corkboard covered with dozens of photographs. My stomach tightened as I stepped closer, examining them in the dim glow. Faces. Dozens of faces. All wearing orange jumpsuits, each photo faded, some curled at the edges. My fingers traced the images, dread pooling deeper. Each face bore the same haunted expression, eyes hollow, resigned. Beneath each photo was a date, hastily scrawled. My breath caught. They weren't inmate numbers. They were dates of arrival. And each inmate, it seemed, had arrived alone. No records of transfers, no case files, just the photos, the dates, and a single word written beneath several pictures in blood-red ink. Withdrawn. At the end of the row, a fresh photograph was pinned, barely faded. My hand shook as I reached for it, lifting it closer. The face in the photo was mine. Below it, today's date was scrawled in the same red ink. I stumbled back, nearly falling. My mind spun. This wasn't an assignment. This was a trap. A sacrifice. They'd sent me here intentionally, knowing exactly what would happen. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating. The air grew colder. Behind me, monitors crackled, screens flickering wildly. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. The footage had changed. Each screen now showed the empty cell 13, but no longer empty. A figure stood motionless in the center, tall, emaciated, head tilted unnaturally. Its face was blurred, shifting constantly, as though my eyes refused to process its true form. It stared directly into the camera, directly at me. I dropped the flashlight, its beam rolling wildly across the floor, shadows twisting grotesquely. The landline phone suddenly rang, shrill, insistent, shattering the oppressive silence. I grabbed it instinctively, pressing it to my ear, voice hoarse with panic. Hello? Only silence, deep and heavy. Then a slow, labored breathing emerged, wet and ragged as though struggling through liquid. Then a voice, my own voice, whispered back to me from the receiver, twisted and distorted. You don't belong here. The line went dead. A sudden pounding erupted at the door behind me, hard and violent. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. The sound of metal bending, hinges straining. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, eyes locked on the door as it began to dent inward, each blow stronger than the last. I screamed, voice cracking, pleading for whatever was out there to stop, to leave me alone. But the pounding continued, relentless, inhumanly strong. Finally, with a deafening crash, the door exploded inward, splinters scattering across the room. In the shattered doorway stood the figure from the monitors, impossibly tall, hunched, limbs elongated. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over sharp bones. Its face blurred, features shifting, except for its eyes, 2 black voids that drank in all light. It stepped forward slowly, joints cracking audibly, head jerking sideways, studying me like prey. My body refused to move, paralyzed by fear. It spoke, voice distorted, overlapping whispers emerging from its mouth, echoing around me. You broke the rules. You answered the knocking. You looked where you shouldn't. Now you're mine. I finally broke free, scrambling toward the open door, slipping through the gap between its twisted limbs. It reached for me, fingers grazing my arm, skin searing with cold. I sprinted down the hall, breath ragged, darkness pressing in from all sides. Behind me, its slow, dragging footsteps echoed, unhurried, inevitable. I reached another door, marked, restricted area, keep out. Desperation overrode caution. I flung it open, barreling inside. The room was empty except for a single object in the center, an old, rusted electric chair, leather straps hanging loosely, stained dark. From behind, a chilling whisper slithered into my ear, inches away. "Welcome home." Hands seized me, powerful and cold, dragging me toward the chair. I fought wildly, kicking, screaming, but their grip was iron. They forced me down, straps tightening themselves around my wrists and ankles, metal clasps clicking shut. The figure loomed over me, blurred face inches from mine. "You wanted to study us," it whispered, voice carrying infinite malice. "Now you'll have eternity to learn." The room spun, vision fading as pain erupted, electricity surging through me, burning every nerve. I screamed until my throat tore, consciousness slipping away. My last thought echoed through the pain. I was never meant to leave Black Bayou. No one ever did. When consciousness returned, it crawled back slowly, painfully, like a wounded animal dragging itself from the shadows. Every nerve in my body ached, muscles spasmed in protest, and my skin felt raw, as though I'd been flayed alive. I gasped sharply, sucking in stale, foul air that tasted of rust and decay, and my eyelids flickered open to darkness so absolute it felt solid, pressing against my face, smothering me. I shifted, or tried to, but my limbs were heavy, unresponsive. I soon realized why. My wrists and ankles were still bound tightly by thick leather straps, biting deep into my skin. The electric chair. The realization hit me like a physical blow, dread flooding back in a nauseating wave. I was still strapped into that hideous device, the very symbol of finality, designed not just to kill but to punish. But how was I still alive? My thoughts raced, desperately trying to piece together the fragmented memories, the searing pain, the grotesque figure looming over me, the realization that this prison, this cursed place, had claimed me. I strained against the restraints, struggling wildly, but they held firm, unyielding. Panic surged again, primal and fierce, clawing at my sanity. Then, suddenly, the room filled with a low mechanical hum. Harsh fluorescent lights blinked on above me, painfully bright, their buzzing drilling into my skull. I squinted, eyes watering, adjusting to the glaring illumination. It revealed an empty chamber, walls bare concrete, stained dark in places, the floor dotted with ancient, rust-colored patches. The air was thick, heavy, laced with the stench of burnt flesh and ozone. There were no windows, no visible doors, only blank, featureless walls surrounding me, suffocating and inescapable. Directly ahead stood a large, cracked mirror mounted on the wall, reflecting my own image back at me. My blood ran cold at what I saw. My face was pale, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. My hair had grayed, thinning in places, and my lips were cracked and dry. I barely recognized the broken, haunted figure staring back. How long had I been here? Hours? Days? But worse was the figure standing just behind me, reflected in the mirror. Tall, emaciated, its features still blurred and shifting, a shadow given flesh. It stood perfectly still, directly behind the chair, watching me silently. I jerked around in terror, but the room behind me was empty. The figure existed only in the reflection. I turned back to the mirror, my breath ragged. The entity tilted its head slowly, studying me with cold curiosity. Then it spoke, its voice seeping into my mind, a whisper resonating from deep within my skull, layered and echoing as though many voices spoke in perfect unison. "Do you understand now?" I struggled to respond, voice cracking with fear. Understand what? It stepped closer, its reflection looming larger, towering over me, fingers elongated, skeletal. "You were never the observer. You were always the subject." My heart sank, horror spreading through my veins like poison. What does that mean? You came to study prisoners. Now you are one. You came to understand monsters. Now you will become one. My breath caught, words lodging in my throat. No, I'm not like you. I'm not like them. Its blurred face twisted slightly, as though amused. Not yet. A loud metallic grinding noise echoed around me. The wall beside the mirror split open, concrete scraping against concrete, revealing a dark corridor beyond. The restraints binding me clicked open suddenly, releasing my limbs. I stood shakily, muscles screaming in protest, bones feeling brittle, fragile. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee this nightmare, but there was nowhere else to go. The room offered no exits except the newly revealed passage. I stumbled forward, legs weak, forcing myself into the darkness beyond. The corridor was narrow, its walls slick with condensation, reeking of mold. I moved cautiously, each step painful, echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. The passage twisted endlessly, like an artery burrowing deeper into the facility's diseased heart. The air grew colder, wetter, pressing harder against my lungs with each passing step. Eventually, it opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. The room stretched far beyond what was possible, its ceiling high, shrouded in mist, the floor slick and uneven, littered with rusted chains, discarded manacles, and shattered bones. It resembled no prison cell but something older, darker, a forgotten place of punishment, suffering, and despair. At its center stood a massive, ornate wooden door, intricately carved with grotesque figures and symbols I couldn't comprehend. The wood was ancient, rotted, pulsating faintly, as though alive. I approached it hesitantly, drawn by some irresistible force. My fingers traced the carvings, each symbol painful to touch, like razor blades slicing my skin. Suddenly, from behind the door, a rhythmic knocking began. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. The same knocking I'd heard throughout the prison. The same knocking the rules had warned me not to answer. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside my room. It was coming from inside this door, inside this place of endless torment. My hand trembled against the wood, blood trickling freely from my fingertips, mingling with the ancient, warped surface. Then, with dreadful certainty, I understood. This door didn't lead out. It led deeper. This was the heart of Black Bayou, the source of all its horror. Behind it was something older than the prison, older than the swamp, older than memory itself. Something eternal, hungering, imprisoned not by walls, but by fear and rules. Rules I had broken, unleashing its bonds, awakening its appetite. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The whispers returned, countless voices blending into a single, overwhelming chorus. Open it. Let us out. Join us. My body moved against my will, hand gripping the rusted handle, turning it slowly. The door creaked, hinges protesting as it swung inward, revealing absolute darkness beyond. A darkness that moved, shifted, flowed like living shadow, pouring outward, enveloping me in its embrace. I felt it seep into me, cold and invasive, burrowing beneath my skin, filling every hollow space inside. My mind fractured, memories splintering, identity dissolving. I saw the faces of every inmate I'd studied, their lives absorbed into this darkness, their fears feeding it. And now, mine joined theirs, another fragment in its endless hunger. As the shadows consumed me, I heard the voice once more, now coming from within myself. You are home. You belong here. I understood then that Black Bayou was never just a prison. It was a trap, an eternal cycle. Inmates arrived, studied the horror, broke the rules, and became part of it. The rules had never been meant to protect. They had always been meant to fail, ensuring the prison remained forever full, forever feeding the thing behind the door. As the darkness took me, I knew another agent would come soon, sent to study prisoners, to follow the rules, to fail. Another face added to the corkboard, another whisper echoing through these endless halls. And when they arrived, they'd find me here, waiting. Awareness returned slowly, like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The first sensation was cold, biting, all-consuming cold, that seeped through my skin, penetrating bone deep until it settled in my core. The second was silence, absolute, oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums like an unbearable weight. I tried to move, to shift even slightly, but my limbs refused to obey, locked in place as if bound by unseen chains. When my eyes finally fluttered open, I found myself back in the observation room, the same small, suffocating room where the nightmare had begun. The chair beneath me was rigid, uncomfortable, the metal cold and unyielding. My hands lay limply on the steel desk, skin pale and ghostly beneath the harsh fluorescent light that flickered intermittently overhead. Panic surged through me, sharp and primal. I jerked upward, muscles trembling violently. How was I here again? Was everything I'd experienced, the electric chair, the hidden chamber, the ancient, living darkness, just a hallucination? A twisted nightmare? But as my vision cleared, dread blossomed anew. My reflection stared back at me from the observation glass, gaunt, broken, eyes sunken and hollow, filled with exhaustion and fear. Yet the mirror didn't show an empty cell beyond. Instead, it revealed another figure, seated calmly on the other side of the glass, wearing a familiar orange jumpsuit. It was me, not the haggard version I'd become, but a younger, unbroken version, freshly arrived, confident, clipboard in hand, eyes bright with curiosity and purpose. My breath caught, horror crawling up my spine. I stood shakily, pressing a trembling hand against the glass. The younger version of myself didn't react, oblivious, focused on something in his hands. The one-way glass still stood between us, but now I was the inmate, trapped on the wrong side of the mirror. "No," I whispered, my voice raw, cracking. "This isn't right." Then, behind me, someone spoke. A voice I recognized instantly, low and amused, dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Funny, isn't it?" I spun around, heart hammering. The inmate from cell number 9 stood there, leaning casually against the cell's far wall, arms crossed loosely, eyes glittering with dark amusement. But he was no longer behind glass, no longer separated from me. We were together, prisoners now, trapped in the same unbreakable cycle. "You?" I gasped, throat dry. "What is this?" He smirked knowingly. "This is the truth, the real Black Bayou." He pushed off the wall, moving toward me slowly. "You thought you were sent here to study us, but you were never the observer. You were always the experiment." I shook my head wildly, stumbling back until my shoulders hit the cold glass. "They'll come for me. They know I'm here." He laughed softly, bitterly. "No one knows you're here. They erased you, just like they erased all of us. You're a ghost now, just another face on that corkboard, another forgotten sacrifice to keep the cycle going." I turned, pounding desperately on the glass, screaming at my younger self on the other side. "Look at me. Listen. You have to get out. Don't break the rules. Please." But he remained oblivious, scribbling notes, fascinated by the cell, by the darkness, unaware of the figure just behind him. A tall, emaciated shadow, faceless, reaching slowly toward him. I watched helplessly as its long, skeletal fingers hovered inches from his neck, caressing the air with malevolent anticipation. "Stop!" I screamed again, my voice cracking, blood pounding in my ears. The inmate behind me spoke quietly. "It won't stop. It never stops. That's the cycle. He comes, studies, breaks the rules, and then he's here with us. Another takes his place. It's eternal, endless. That's how it feeds." I spun around, fury mixing with terror. Who is it? What does it want? He met my gaze, eyes dark and empty. It's not human, not anymore. Maybe it never was. It's older than the prison, older than the swamp. It feeds on us, our fear, our confusion, our pain. But mostly it feeds on hope. The hope we'll escape, the hope someone will come for us. But they never do. I sank to my knees, despair consuming me. There has to be a way out. There's always a way out. He smiled sadly, shaking his head. That's what we all say. But hope is the worst prison of all. Suddenly the walls trembled, the lights flickered violently, and the inmate's eyes widened with sudden dread. "It's coming," he whispered, voice shaking. "It always comes back." Darkness seeped through cracks in the walls, pooling like ink, rising, coalescing into that hideous figure. Tall, blurred, shifting constantly, radiating ancient malevolence. Its blank, void-like eyes locked onto mine, and a whisper echoed through my skull, cold and relentless. "You belong to me now." I screamed, raw and desperate, but my voice was swallowed by darkness. I watched in helpless horror as the younger version of myself turned around slowly, finally sensing the presence behind him, eyes widening in terror. I reached out futilely, as darkness enveloped him too, the figure consuming him, dragging him into shadow. Then silence. Absolute, crushing silence. And then I was back, alone in cell number 9, the mirror intact, showing only my reflection. My orange jumpsuit felt heavier, more constricting. I sat numbly on the cot, staring at my hands, scarred, pale, the hands of a prisoner. My mind reeled, memories blending, blurring, fraying at the edges. How long had I been here? How many times had I relived this horror? The door swung open abruptly, a new guard stepping inside, clipboard in hand. Young, fresh-faced, nervous but determined. His eyes darted around cautiously, his posture tense. I stood slowly, approaching the glass, watching him carefully. He stared back, unaware I could see him. He spoke softly, almost to himself, glancing at the rules clutched tightly in his hands. Observation session number 1. My lips curled into a faint, weary smile. The cycle continued, unbroken, eternal. As I leaned closer, studying him, I realized my reflection no longer matched my movements. It stood behind me, smiling coldly, detached, a shadowed version of myself, what I had become. Its hand lifted slowly, tapping gently against the glass. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more, echoing through the cell, through the prison, through eternity. The new guard glanced down at the rules, hesitating, unaware of what awaited him, unaware of his fate already sealed. I leaned closer still, my voice a whisper, echoing through the barrier that no longer separated us. "You're new here, aren't you?" His head snapped up, eyes wide with fear and confusion, just as mine had once been. "Welcome to Black Bayou," I continued softly, resignedly. "We'll be seeing a lot more of each other." Behind me, the darkness stirred, hungry and patient, waiting for the next inevitable misstep, the next broken rule, waiting to feed. And deep within, I understood now that escape was impossible, hope was cruel, and in Black Bayou, time was meaningless. We were trapped, all of us, prisoners, guards, observers, locked in an endless cycle of fear and despair, feeding the ancient darkness forever. I stepped back, sitting heavily on my cot, eyes closing, waiting. There was no end. There was only Black Bayou, eternal and hungry. And soon, very soon, another would join us, Time had lost all meaning within Black Bayou. Days blended into nights, minutes stretched into eternities, and memories twisted together until nothing was clear. Nothing was certain. All that remained was the cycle, an endless repetition of suffering, waiting, and inevitable failure. Yet within that endless darkness, a single flickering ember remained. Hope. A cruel, fragile hope that refused to be extinguished, even in this forsaken place. I sat on my cot, back pressed against the cold concrete wall, staring blankly ahead at the one-way mirror that no longer separated me from anything. The observation room beyond remained empty, awaiting its next occupant, its next victim. The new guard had fled hours ago, but he'd be back. They always came back. They always thought they could follow the rules, that they could outsmart this place. But in the end, they always broke, always failed. I glanced down at my hands, calloused, worn, fingers twitching slightly with nerves frayed from relentless torment. How many had I seen pass through this cell? How many had I tried to warn, to save? It never mattered. They never listened. They couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. Not really. The rules blinded them, trapped them, just as they had trapped me. Yet something was different now. Something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. The darkness that had consumed me, that had consumed all of us, had grown restless. The shadows writhed uneasily at the edges of the cell, whispering to themselves in agitated murmurs. It was as though the cycle had begun to strain, to weaken under the weight of its own repetition. As if, after countless failures, there was finally a crack in Black Bayou's unyielding grip. I stood slowly, feeling a strange surge of determination, something I hadn't felt in what seemed like lifetimes. My eyes darted around the cell, searching for anything I might have missed, any detail that could offer even the slightest glimmer of escape. My gaze fell upon the observation glass again, its surface reflecting my hollow expression. But something caught my eye. A faint imperfection, a hairline fracture at the bottom corner of the mirror, barely visible but undeniably there. I moved closer, heart quickening. I hadn't noticed it before. Had it always been there? I reached out, fingertips brushing gently over the cracked surface. The glass was icy, brittle. It shifted slightly beneath my touch, delicate and fragile. I pressed harder, and the crack spread slowly, spiderwebbing outward, deeper and wider. Hope surged again, fierce and desperate. This was something new, something real, a weakness in the cycle. Perhaps this was it, the way out, the path to breaking free of this eternal torment. I struck the mirror with the heel of my hand, wincing at the pain, but the glass fractured further, shards splintering outward. Blood trickled down my palm, but I didn't care. Pain was proof of life, of existence, and right now, that mattered more than anything. I hit the glass again, harder this time. It cracked audibly, splinters of glass falling away. The mirror groaned, weakened, shattering inward with a final decisive blow. The barrier collapsed, leaving a gaping hole, jagged edges gleaming under flickering lights. I stared through the opening, breathing heavily. The observation room beyond was silent, empty, waiting. But now it was open, no longer a trap, no longer a prison. This was my chance, perhaps the only chance anyone had ever had. I climbed through carefully, avoiding the sharp edges, dropping heavily onto the cold floor on the other side. For a moment, I paused, catching my breath, expecting the darkness to seize me again, to drag me back. But nothing happened. The cell behind me remained silent, still. The darkness retreated, wary, uncertain. I moved quickly, stumbling toward the observation room door, grasping the handle and twisting. It swung open easily, silently, revealing the empty corridor beyond. My pulse raced, Could this be real? Could I truly escape? I ran down the corridor, breath ragged, footsteps echoing. The halls twisted and shifted around me, but I didn't stop. I refused to stop. Doors slammed shut behind me. Cell doors rattled violently, but I ignored them all. Black Bayou was furious, desperate to reclaim me, to maintain the cycle. But this time, I refused to yield. Finally, I reached the entrance. The same heavy, rusted doors I'd entered what felt like centuries ago. I grasped the handle, pulling with every ounce of strength I had left. The doors resisted, groaning loudly, but slowly they creaked open, letting in a sliver of weak dawn light, pale and fragile, illuminating the fog-covered swamp beyond. My breath caught. I was free. Or almost. I stumbled outside, collapsing to my knees on damp, moss-covered earth, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. The fog curled around me, cool and soothing. Behind me, the doors slammed shut, locking with deafening finality. But I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I knew if I did, the cycle might reclaim me once more. Instead, I forced myself to my feet, staggering forward, leaving the cursed prison behind, deeper into the misty swamp, toward the distant, rising sun. As I walked, the fog thickened, swirling around me, blurring my vision. But I kept moving forward, driven by pure determination. I had broken the cycle, shattered the chains of despair. I was free. Or so I thought. When the fog cleared, I stood frozen, disbelief coursing through me. Ahead, looming out of the mist, stood another familiar sight. High concrete walls, floodlights, rusted gates. Another prison, identical to Black Bayou, standing silent and imposing, waiting. My heart sank, dread returning. I turned slowly, but behind me, where I had just fled, was nothing, only empty swamp, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Realization dawned, cruel and bitter. There was never any escape. The cycle wasn't limited to Black Bayou. It was everywhere. Prisons within prisons, each one waiting, each one feeding on fear, on hope. And from somewhere deep within this new prison, faintly, I heard the sound of knocking. 3 taps, pause, 3 more, echoing endlessly, calling me forward, promising hope, promising escape. I sank to my knees again, laughter bubbling up, hysterical, desperate, broken. The cycle was endless. Hope was the cruelest prison of all. And now I knew it would never end,